Hi, I'm Stephanie, and welcome to my TBR Rewind series, episode 4, where I'm tackling my TBR list from bottom to top. Today, we are talking about Bodywork by Melissa Febos. In this bold mix of memoir and masterclass, Melissa Febos tackles the emotional, psychological, and physical work of writing intimately while offering an utterly fresh examination of the storyteller's life and questions that run through it. So she has previously written books regarding her life as a dominatrix, in addition to struggling with addiction and own personal trauma. And this, I thought was one thing, ended up being another. Although I wanted to come back and give you a halfway reading report, I ended up DNFing this. And not because it was anything wrong with the book, just because it really wasn't anything that I needed. This is really a work about how writers should write about sex, about bodies, specifically about women. And that is nothing that I'm doing. However, I did find some things that were very interesting about it. So one of the things that she values is writing as a form of therapy and trauma work. So she says, "There is no pain in my life that has not been given value by the alchemy of creative attention." Additionally, she says, "Expressive writing about trauma strengthens the immune system, decreases obsessive thinking, and contributes to the overall health of writers. The articulation of painful memories, including the literature and art that arises out of political upheaval, is integral to the formation, preservation, and integration of collective memory." So whether it's an individual or a class of people telling their story and dealing and processing their trauma, everything that comes out of that is not only beautiful and fulfilling and a way to help you deal with that, but also as a preservation of that time and those decisions, and hopefully in the art of history not repeating itself for negative values can help people learn. And then this is a phrase that she says, "My sexuality has been the single most powerful, disruptive force mankind has ever perceived, and its repression has been the work of centuries." So just sit and think about that for a minute. So while I did not finish this book, I do think it is of value if you find yourself writing in an area where you are writing about women or about sex or sex work or any of the things that you want to take a more positive, pro-body, pro-feminist perspective on. I think that this could have some value. Next up on my TBR list is Florence Giles by John Harding. A gripping, sinister Gothic tale inspired by and in the tradition of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. In 1891, in a remote and crumbling New England mansion, 12-year-old orphan Florence and her younger brother Giles are neglected by her guardian uncle. Banned from reading, Florence devours books in secret and talks to herself, and narrates her story in a unique language of her own invention. By night, she sleepwalks in the corridor and is troubled by a recurrent dream in which a mysterious woman appears to threaten her younger brother. That sounds interesting. Also, the edition that I have includes Turn of the Screw, which is something that was on my list to read as well. So we will include that work in this episode as well. All right, let's go ahead and get reading. welcome back. We have finished both Turn of the Screw and Florence and Giles, so let's get into my review of them. So we'll start first with Turn of the Screw, just given chronologically, although I did read that one second, but I think it provides a nice background. Turn of the Screw was first published between January and April of 1898 as a series in a weekly magazine, and then was published in October of that same year as a collective book. That is something to keep in mind when you read it, that it was published in series. And so the way that each part ends and the parts that were published together can provide an interesting other construct of the story. So Turn of the Screw is told from the perspective of the governess, who is never named, but she is employed in this house with two children who are essentially there alone, being raised in this house by the housekeeper and the staff. So the name of the house is Bly. And the governess has no name, and the housekeeper's name is Mrs. Groves, and the children are Flora and Miles. So keep all that in mind, and then when we talk about Florence and Giles, which, as you can tell, has a lot of similarities already. So we're following the perspective of the governess, and she thinks things are a little off, and we're given a description of the children that make them seem essentially angelic. They are beautiful and innocent and pristine, and they glow, and everything just seems perfect. Then the governess starts to see images that she is unsure of whether or not they are real or apparitions, spiritual apparitions of a man and a woman. And she speaks to this to the housekeeper, and the housekeeper identifies them as Peter Quint and Miss Jessel, who used to live in the house or be associated with the house and had a little bit of a traumatic, tumultuous history. So the governess then becomes convinced that these are evil spirits here to haunt the children. So Mrs. Groves, the housekeeper, is only hearing this through the governess's perspective. She herself never sees these apparitions, never notices anything wrong, but the governess really gets her riled up about this. So she believes it just as much as the governess does, even though she's never experienced it for herself. And then the tension heightens when the governess believes that she sees one of the children communicating with the ghosts directly. Things really kind of go out of hand there. And it's a short book, so that's pretty much the synopsis. And then towards the end, there is a final climactic scene with the governess and Miles, the boy. And you sort of are left with the ability to interpret the ending as you want. So there isn't anything explicitly told about what happens. You are just sort of given an end scene and a cliffhanger, so to speak, that allows you to think about what you think happened based on the information that you received during the story and how you think those circumstances came to be. So this was really interesting. And I will say I had trouble reading the prose. So reading the book, and you'll see in the clip, I sound like I'm probably mouthing words, is because I had gotten some advice that if you're having trouble with reading something just with your eyes, to try to read it out loud. I tried that, and then I switched over to the audiobook, which was perfect. That helped so much. So I was reading the book in concert with listening to the audiobook, so immersive reading, and that was wonderful and really brought me into the story. So if you're having trouble with the prose, because it is Victorian 19th century prose, so it is long, if you're having trouble with that, jump over to the audiobook, which you can find free a lot of places, and listen to it in concert. So this is interesting too, because given when it was published and how it was published, it could almost have been read out loud as like a ghost story. And then each week you would wait for the next installment. And then next we have Florence and Giles, which was I don't know if you would call it a retelling, or I guess you would call it a retelling rather than a reimagining, because it is fairly consistent with the story. So the house is called Blythe. The governess is named. She is Miss Taylor. The children are Florence and Giles, although in this case, the female child is older. The housekeeper is Mrs. Grouse, and there is a absent uncle. So it is fairly exact. The differences lie in that this story is told in the perspective of Florence, so one of the children, who is welcoming in this governess in light that their past governess died of mysterious circumstances. And the governess learns of that when she comes. But the governess has a very odd air about her. And so Florence immediately becomes suspicious of the governess and what her intentions are. We go through this whole thing, and really the supernatural aspect of it is that the governess has an ability to project herself into the mirrors of the house. And so she can watch and see everything that's happening, even though she's not in the room. Florence is the only one that can see her in these mirrors. And so this starts Florence into a frenzy, really focused on how to avoid the mirrors, what to do to get around the mirrors, so that she can proceed throughout the house to do whatever it is she wants to do. There's also a couple of ancillary characters that weren't. So there's more characters from the town that play a role in this story, as opposed to the other story. It was just the characters within the house. So you also have a much more directed plot line here. So it is very clear at the end of the book what happens, and there's not a lot of guessing that I picked up on to determine, any sort of area for interpretation that the reader is allowed to give. I guess maybe it's whether you believe who might be an unreliable narrator or who is a reliable narrator. The events of the story seem to play out fairly linearly. So it took me a minute to figure out what star rating I wanted to give these books. And of course, the star rating doesn't really matter. It's highly subjective. But I think what I would give is Turn of the Screw 4 stars and Florence and Giles 3 to 3.5 stars. I think that Turn of the Screw was written first, so it is more novel of a concept. And I think it just did the supernatural a little bit better. I would say Florence and Giles felt more like a traditional modern ghost story that you would read, which I don't think I told you. So Florence and Giles was published in 2010, so it is modern, and it does have that feel. So I think if you were going to read one of these, I would also read Turn of the Screw. I wouldn't just read Florence and Giles, or you could just read Turn of the Screw and maybe have more of the atmosphere that you might be looking for if you're looking for more of a ghost story. Right, coming up next, we have Hotel by Arthur Haley, and we are going to be spending 5 sultry days in a hotel with the assistant general manager and going through a murder, a theft, a conspiracy. Seems like there's a lot going on in this hotel. Check back for episode 5 of my TBR Rewind series to hear about Hotel by Arthur Haley. See you next time.